The cut list went up its sixth bell, and by the time the echo died, 400 cadets were pressing toward the muster board like a tide against lock gate. Vasarekdul stood at the back of the crush and let his height do the work, reading the bronze slate over 300 skulls, crests, and ear membranes. The Drenok Spire Academy did not post the names of the cut. It posted the names of the kept, etched in metal, and let everyone else learn arithmetic. His own name sat fourth from the top of the Grace Bar roster. He had known it would. Tarvex of his line had anchored gates on the old Hulk for 6 generations, and the selectors had been watching his shoulders since his second molt. There was no suspense in it for him, which meant he had attention to spare, and that was the only reason he saw the human at all. The human was working against the current. Everyone else pushed toward the slate to find their names or their absences. The human had already read it, or had never needed to, and was moving away from it, toward the smaller board bolted at knee height beneath the bronze. That board was gray composite, scratched and ignored, and it carried the auxiliary muster sheet, the standing call for wall fodder, the practice target roster, the list nobody signed unless a disciplinary officer was holding their arm. The human signed it. He had to crouch to do it, which made him briefly the smallest object in a hall, built for species who averaged a third again his height. He printed his name in blocky off-world script, hung the stylus back on its hook, and straightened up into the silence of perhaps 40 cadets who had stopped reading the bronze to watch him do something no one at Drenok had done, voluntarily in living memory. Voss read the name upside down from 9 paces away. Because Tarvek's eyes were built for reading heat script through hull smoke and a knee-high, signature was nothing. Milo Brandt, auxiliary intake, support trade second year standing, height somewhere under 1.60 meters, mass at a guess, less than Voss's left arm. He knows what that sheet is, said Ketterell at Voss's elbow. Ketterell was Gracebar's Gate 3 runner, an Ofex, tall and gracile with ear membranes that flushed dark when she was entertained. They were dark now. Someone should tell him. He read the bronze first, Voss said. He looked for his name, then he signed, he knows. What the sheet was formally was the auxiliary ascent provision, a founder's era clause that let any cadet in good standing offer themselves as practice opposition for the house squads. What it was in practice was a meat ration. The ascent was played on the Veridan, a decommissioned breach carrier bolted nose down to the academy ring, 9 gates deep, gravity sections rotating on the old combat cycle. House squads trained on it 5 days and 6, and training meant somebody had to stand in the gates and be removed from them, over and over, by cadets bred and built for removal. The provision dated from a century when the academy had 3 times the enrollment and a different opinion about attrition. Modern cadets did not sign it. Modern cadets did the arithmetic. The human walked out of the muster hall through a corridor of stairs, and Voss noticed, filed away with no particular emotion, that he did not walk like someone escaping. He walked like someone who had completed an errand on a list and was moving to the next item. Gracebar's first wall session of the term fell 2 days later, and the human was there at the Veridan's intake lock when the squad cycled through, standing beside the equipment racks in a practice harness that had been resized for him by someone with more sympathy than skill. The shoulder yokes had been taken in so far the strapping bunched like rope. He looked, Voss thought, like cargo that had been lashed for transport. Squad Master Hesh looked at him for a long moment. Hesh was old Tarvex, gate-scared, with one dorsal plate cracked and badly fused from a fixture 40 years gone, and he had a way of going still that made younger cadets check their footing. Brandt. Squad Master. You signed the provision. Yes, Squad Master. You understand what the provision is. I stand in the gates. Your squad takes the gates. I get up. They take them again. The human's voice was level, unhurried, pitched to carry exactly as far as Hesh and no farther. If I'm ever in danger of slowing the drill down, you'll tell me, and I'll fix it. Ketterell's membranes went dark again. Down the rack line, Dargan, Gate 5 holder, Brell, 4 arms and a torso like a bollard, made the clicking sound Brell's made instead of laughing. Hesh did not make any sound at all. He looked at the human the way he looked at a gate mechanism that had been reported faulty, without hope, but thoroughly. The Veridan runs combat rotation, he said. Section cycle from full weight to a quarter and back on a 90 count. Cadets your mass get thrown by the transitions. The medics log more auxiliary injuries from the floor than from contact. I read the rotation schedule, the human said. I've been walking the maintenance catwalks on my off shift since the term posted. The transitions have a tell. The deck comes a half second before the section shifts. He paused. I won't slow the drill down. It was, Voss would think much later, the only boast he ever heard Milo Brandt make, and it was not even a boast, it was a maintenance report. They ran the first drill at half tempo, the way every squad ran the first drill of a term, gates 1 through 4, holders set, runners cycling. The human's job was to stand in gate 2 and be an obstacle. Gate 2 belonged to Voss's training rotation that day, which is how Vasarekh Dul came to be the first cadet at the Dranok Spire Academy to put hands on the human, lift him out of the gate frame, and set him down on the deck behind it. It took less effort than racking a training bag. The human went where he was put, rolled with it, and was on his feet before Voss had reset the gate. Again, the human said they went again. Voss removed him again. He got up again. By the 8th cycle, Voss had stopped registering him as opposition and started registering him as a rhythm. Lift, place, reset, and there he'd be in the frame once more, set lower this time. Grip changed, 1 foot braced on the gate lip where the frame gave him an angle. It changed nothing. Voss outmassed him 4-1. But the 9th time, Voss noticed his own grip had to shift to account for the brace, and the 10th time the human had moved his brace again, and Voss had the strange experience of needing to pay attention to a task that should not have required any. At the session's end, the squad cycled to the wash racks and the human stayed behind on the deck, and Voss, last out, saw him do the thing for the first time. There was a guide rail along the Veridan's intake passage, old steel, gouged and polished by a century of gauntleted hands. The human took a short blade from his boot, a rigger's blade legal, the kind every cargo trade cadet carried, and cut a single small notch underside of the rail, where a hand would feel it but an inspection wouldn't see it. Then he racked his harness and left. He had been removed from a gate by Voss's count 26 times in one session, and he had marked the steel like a man keeping score of something he was winning. Voss mentioned it at the house table that night, mostly because Ketterell collected oddities the way other cadets collected fixture pennants. 1 notch, he said, not 26. 1. He's not counting falls. Sessions then, Ketterell said. He's counting sessions. Assence, said Dargan, who had been at the Veridan longer than either of them, and ate with all 4 elbows on the table. Auxiliary runs the wall after the squads cycle out. Old provision right. Nobody uses it. He flexed a lower hand toward the ring's window band, where the Veridan's hull caught the light of Course's storm bands, amber and slow. Wall time after hours, no spotters, no medics on station. You'd have to be broken to want it. He wasn't broken. That was the thing Voss kept failing to make the picture explain. Over the following span, the human stood in Grayspar's gates 4 sessions in 6, was removed somewhere between 20 and 40 times a session by cadets who could load freight pallets one-handed, and got up every single time with the unhurried economy of a man getting out of a chair. And after the squad cycled out, he stayed and ran the wall alone in the dead rotation, gate 1 to gate 9, full transitions, no one watching but whoever happened to pass the intake lock and glance through the port. 1 ascent, sometimes 2. Then 1 notch in the rail, sometimes 2, cut small and clean in the steel underside where his own hand would pass over them the next day. Voss began glancing through the port on his way past. He told himself it was the way you watched a slow accident, but Tarveks were bad liars even inside their own skulls, and what he actually felt, watching the small figure work the transitions alone in the amber dark, was the specific unease of seeing someone spend a currency you didn't recognize. The first fixture of the season came at term 6 span. Grayspar against House Merrick, 3 rotations on the Veridan, gates live, the ladder board freshly zeroed. Grayspar lost it by a gate and a half. It was not a disgrace. Merrick had returned 7 of 9 from a squad that had taken the Iron Pennant's 2nd seat the year before, but it was a loss, and losses at Drenok had a physiology. Voss felt the slack come on in the 3rd rotation, when Merrick went 2 gates up and the probability of the fixture turned visibly against them. The vestral gland behind his sternum, doing what 100,000 generations of Tarvek survival had built it to do, metering the odds and quietly withdrawing the body's commitment from a spent cause. The Tarveks called it the slack. Every species on the ring had a name for their own version. It was not cowardice, and no one called it that. It was biology, the ancient circuit that kept ancestors from dying for lost positions, and Academy doctrine treated it as a constant, like gravity. You planned around the slack. You built fixture strategies that kept your squad believing the win was live, because the moment the belief went, the body followed, and no amount of discipline could outvote a gland. Grayspar's last rotation that day was 4 minutes of large, strong, well-trained cadets moving at 9/10 commitment, and everyone on the Veridan could see it, and no one could do anything about it, because it was a law of bodies. Merrick's squad had the same gland and the same law. They simply had the lead, so theirs never fired. In the wash racks afterward, the silence was the usual post-loss silence with the usual texture. Voss sat with his plates dripping and his head down. 2 stalls along, the human, who had not played, who would never play, who had spent the fixture hauling reset cables for the gate crew because of auxiliary did that too, was wring out his underlayer. And Dargan, who hurt the way Brells hurt, loudly and at the nearest target said, "Enjoy the show, Brandt? That's the game you signed your bones to. That's the famous ascent." The human considered this with the same expression he gave gate mechanisms. Your squad was still moving at the end, he said. At 9/10. We were beaten the moment the second gate fell, and the whole ring knows it. The slack took us. It always takes the side that's down. That's the ascent, little one. The game decides who it lets keep trying. Huh, the human said, and went back to wringing out his underlayer. And then, because Dargan kept staring at him, he added in the tone of a man mentioning weather, "Where I'm from, that part's optional." Voss thought about that sentence for 6 days, which annoyed him, because it was obviously a small species being brave in a wash rack. Then the Span's medical lecture rotation happened to put the second years in front of surgeon instructor Avery Class Comparative Physiology, and Voss, who had never once volunteered a question in a lecture hall, heard his own voice ask the Kelith surgeon what the human equivalent of the vestral gland was. The surgeon's answer took 4 minutes. Voss retained one sentence of it for the rest of his life. There is no human equivalent. The cutoff they have can be argued with, and humans argue with it. And there are documented cases of them simply continuing for years past any defensible projection of success. The cutoff can be argued with. He looked it up afterward in the open xenobiology stacks, hunched at a reading bench built for a species half again his height's natural seating. Human motivational architecture ran on narrative, not actuarial computation. A human could be losing by every measurable axis and decline to register it as loss. The text framed this, with a faint clinical embarrassment, as a defect that had somehow survived selection on the most lethal garden world in the charted volume, a species whose bodies kept billing effort to accounts that any sane gland would have closed. The text did not say what it might do to a squad to train beside it. There was no chapter on that. No one had run the experiment. The experiment let himself into the Veridan that night, as he did every night, and stood alone at the base of Gate 1 while the sections cycled their amber dark overhead and spat on his palms, an earth gesture. Voss had looked that up too and started to climb. By the close of the first term, the notches under the intake rail numbered 91. Voss knew because he had counted them, one evening when the passage was empty, crouching to run a thumb claw along the steel underside like a cadet checking a blade edge. 91 ascents. 91 solo transits of a 9-gate combat hulk in dead rotation, logged in no ledger, reported to no officer, witnessed mostly by no one, cut into the metal of the oldest structure on the ring by a man whose name the bronze slate had declined to keep. He never asked the human why he counted that way, steel instead of paper, the hand instead of the eye. But he understood it the way you understand a load by lifting it. A mark in a ledger asks someone else to believe it. A notch in the rail only had to be true. The second term opened with the ladder reset, a new fixture draw, and an addition to Gracebar's training methodology that no one ever formally proposed, approved, or named. It happened the way doctrine actually happens, sideways out of embarrassment. Myrick's Gate 2 runner had a feint they could not solve. The squad had bled half a span of sessions trying to drill a counter, with Ketterell playing the Myrick runner's part off the fixture recordings, and it kept not working, because Ketterell was Ketterell, too tall, too smooth, too honest in her lines. Then one session the human, waiting in the gate frame to be removed as usual, said that's not the feint. He drops his lead shoulder a half count early, and his eyes go to the holder's feet, like this. And he ran it correctly. He ran it at 1/4 the mass and 2/3 the height, and it did not matter, because a feint is information, not force, and the information was perfect. He had stood in gates being removed by squads for a term and a half, and he had spent 400 falls worth of close-range attention on how cadets moved when they meant it and how they moved when they were lying, and somewhere in the catalog of his patience, he had simply filed the answer. Voss took the bait that session and got beaten by a 150-something centimeter human running a Myrick feint in front of his entire squad and stood there in the gate frame while the deck hummed its half-second warning and the section cycled to quarter. Wait, feeling his whole understanding of the auxiliary provision rotate like a gravity ring. Again, Voss said. They went again. He read it the third time. They drilled it 12 more, and then the squad lined up without being told and took turns, and the human ran the feint until everyone from Gate 1 to Gate 9 could smell it coming. And at the session's end, Hesh stood at the intake lock with his cracked plate catching the amber light and said nothing at all, which from Hesh was a commendation with full honors. After that, Gracebar stopped using the human as an obstacle and started using him as a mirror. He could do every squad in the ladder. He had watched them all, auxiliary hauled reset cables at every fixture, and nobody screens what the cable hauler watches, and he held entire houses in his head. Myrick's feints, Calden's gate stacking, Othic's brutal clock-burning holds, Pharaoh's beautiful, arrogant, undefeated cascade. He was the worst athlete on the Veridan and the best opponent at the academy. Beating him proved nothing. Failing to read him cost a session's pride. The squad began without anyone deciding to, arriving early on wall days. The latter noticed before the latter understood. Gracebar took Myrick in the second term's first fixture, Gates 4 to 2.5, and the ring put it down to a young squad maturing. They took Calden in a fixture so one-sided that Calden's squad master requested the rotation logs, looking for a mechanical fault. By midterm, the board had Gracebar third of 9, and other houses had begun discreetly to ask what Gracebar was feeding its second years. What Gracebar was feeding its second years was failure, nightly, in small voluntary doses. Because that was the other thing that had started, also sideways, also unnamed. The first time it was Ketteril, staying after a foul succession to run the wall in dead rotation beside the human, because her Gate 3 exchange had gone wrong twice in a fixture, and something about the small figure ascending in the amber dark made staying feel less like punishment and more like keeping company. The second time it was Ketteril and Dargan both. By the term's middle, there were nights when 5 of the 9 roster cadets ran dead rotation behind the human in a loose, unranked file, and the strangest part, the part Voss could not have explained to his own line elders, was the texture of it. Nobody pushed, nobody scored, and an evening of being repeatedly defeated by a steel hulk in the dark somehow returned them to barracks lighter than they'd left. He asked the human about it once, the two of them last off the wall, the storm bands, of course, rolling amber through the port. Not a real question. Tarvex didn't ask real questions uphill of a third drink. Just, this is the part of my day that makes the least sense to me. The human worked his shoulder where the harness bit. He was a long moment answering, long enough that Voss heard the deck hum and felt the section soften to quarter weight around them. Where I grew up, the human said, the nets had to be checked every shift, and the checking was boring and cold, and nobody ever once thanked you for it. And if you skipped it, people died 8 days later in a way that never traced back to you. So the riggers had a saying. He pulled his harness strap too. You don't rise to the day, you sink to your habits. I'm not very talented, Duel. I noticed that early. It just means I have to be the other thing. Which is what? Still there, the human said, and went to cut his notch. The trouble with rising on the ladder is that the ladder looks back. Gracebar third of 9 meant Gracebar was now worth mocking, and the academy had a venue purpose-built for it. The Concord table, the inter-house meal held each midterm in the ring's long gallery. All 9 houses seated by standing, squad masters at the head wall, the whole assembly conducted under truce rules old enough to have their own grammar. The Concord table was where houses tested each other with words because everything else was rationed. And House Pharaoh sat first of 9, as House Pharaoh had sat for 6 unbroken years. Osek Tain was Pharaoh's captain, a prime-line Tarvex out of the shipwright clans, and he was. Voss never pretended otherwise, then or after magnificent. Tall even for the line, plates like hull armor, the fastest Gate 1 runner the latter had seen in a generation, and bored in the particular way of cadets who had never once needed a second attempt at anything. He waited until the third course when the gallery's noise dipped and pitched his voice for the room. Gracebar, a question of rules, since you keep your own these days. He turned his cup with one claw, lazy. When your mascot stands in a gate and a squad removes it, does that score as taking the gate or as clearing debris? Laughter ran down the tables the way fire runs along a fuel line. Fast where it found welcome, sputtering where it didn't. The human, seated at the auxiliary bench along the gallery's low wall, auxiliary 8 at the Concord table, the founders had been very clear and very ignored, kept eating with the steadiness of a man who had heard the wind change and decided it was still just wind. Because my holders dispute it, Osik went on, warming. They say a thing that small in a gate frame is a safety hazard, like a tool left on the deck. They say the ascent was cut for 9 species and a cargo net climbed in by accident. Be honest with the table, Gracebar. When you notch your little victories down there in the dark, what exactly are you counting? Ascents, or the days the wall declined to kill you? Plenty of cadets at Drennick would have answered. Half the gallery wanted Gracebar to answer. That was the trap's whole shape. Truce rules made anger expensive, and Osset collected other houses' anger like fixture penance. Voss felt his own throat fill with 6 generations of things one did not say at Concord. Across the gallery he saw Hesh at the head wall, watching not Osik but the auxiliary bench, with an expression Voss couldn't read at the time and spent years afterward learning to. The human set down his utensil, unhurried, and stood. Standing, he was shorter than half the cadets sitting. Truce rules gave the answer to whoever the question had named, and the gallery went quiet the way a hull goes quiet when the engine's cut. Days the wall declined to kill me, he said. That's a good count. I like that one. No heat in it at all, the tone of a rigger agreeing about the weather. Mine's at 170-something if you want it. I'll check the rail tonight and get you the exact number, Captain. You should come down and check it yourself sometime. He picked his utensil back up and added mild as dust. Any of the 6 years you've got free. For a heartbeat, the gallery held its breath, parsing it, and then it landed the way only a fair hit lands. 6 unbroken years at the top of the ladder, 6 years of Pharaoh taking the iron pennant, and not once in any of them had Osric Tane been seen on the Veridin outside scheduled squad sessions, because Osric Tane had never needed to be. The human had not called him weak, he had called him untested, and he had done it with arithmetic. And the laughter that went down the tables this time was different fire on a different line. Even 2 seats of Pharaoh's own bench were fighting their faces. Osric smiled the smile of a captain banking a debt and turned his cup and let it go, and Voss, watching him do it, understood that the human had just been promoted from mascot to grievance. "He'll make you pay for that at the fixture," Ketteril said afterward. Delighted, membranes black as ink. "He'll make Grayspar pay," Voss said. "He can't touch auxiliary on the wall. Brant doesn't play." Ketteril said, in the tone of someone enjoying not saying something, and it took Voss until the next wall session to realize what she had decided not to say, that there was no longer a cadet in Grayspar's barracks, the squadmaster included, who heard the words "Brant doesn't play" and felt the sentence sit entirely level. The wrist happened in the 8th span of the 2nd term, in a session that was nobody's fault, which is what made it instructive. A Gate 6 exchange, Dargan at full commitment, the deck humming its half-second tell, and the section cycled early. Mechanical fault, logged and repaired. The Veridin was a century old and entitled to its moods. The gravity went from full to quarter mid-throw. Dargan's mass kept going where mass goes, and the human got his arm between the gate lip and 400 kilos of well-meaning Brel. The crack was small and dry, like a notch being cut. What Voss remembered afterward was the order of operations. The human went down, looked at the wrist, and breathed. 3 slow counts, the gallery quiet kind. Then he said, "Vault on the section, not on you, Dargan. Say it back to me," and waited until Dargan, gray-faced, said it back. Then he tucked the arm against his chest, stood up using legs and balance and nothing else, and walked to the intake lock under his own power, pausing once, every cadet on the deck saw it, to write a reset cable he'd knocked from its hook on the way down. The medics called it a clean fracture and benched him from contact for 5 spans. The squad assumed that meant 5 spans without Brant, and the squad was wrong by the very next evening, when Voss passed the intake port and saw the familiar small figure in the amber dark, harness cinched over a sealed cast, running the wall one-handed. He went in. He had not planned to. "The bench order says no contact," the human said before Voss could speak. "The wall isn't contact. I checked the wording. You checked the wording. Riggers always check the wording." He set his good hand on the Gate 1 frame. "It's slower one-handed. Footwork has to be honest. It's been useful, actually. I'd been letting my grip cover for lazy feet on Gates 4 and 7. Now I can't." He looked back over his shoulder, and in the stormlight Voss saw that he was not smiling exactly, weathering the way steel weathers. You can stand there, or you can take Gate 2 and make yourself useful. Voss took Gate 2. It was the first time he ran the dead rotation, not as penance and not as company, but as practice, his own chosen, and somewhere around Gate 6. Breathing hard in quarter weight behind a one-handed human half his height, he caught himself feeling something his gland had no entry for, and did not try to name it, and cut no notch at the end because the rail wasn't his to mark. The human cut his 191, Voss knew, because counting them, had stopped being surveillance at some point and become something closer to checking on a star. The fixture that turned the term, the one the latter would still be arguing about at year's end, was Grayspar against Othek, 4th span from the close, in front of half the academy, because by then Grayspar fixtures had become the thing you watched. Othek played the oldest game on the board. Take 2 gates fast, then burn the clock with holds, and let the other side's glands do the rest. It was ugly and it was proven, and for 2 rotations it worked exactly as designed. Othek went 2 gates up, the probability turned, and Voss set at Gate 5 with his squad's commitment bleeding out around him in that old familiar tide, felt the slack come on behind his sternum, the gland metering the odds starting its ancient withdrawal, and heard, from the reset lines along the hull wall where auxiliary hauled cable, a single human voice, not shouting, just pitched with a rigger's knack to carry through machinery. Grayspar, still there. That was all. 2 words. The squad's own words by then, worn smooth with nightly use, and what they did was not magic, and the text Voss read afterward never found a gland to credit. What they did was remind 9 cadets, at the precise moment their bodies began closing the account, that they had spent 100 evenings practicing the act of continuing past the point where continuing made sense, that the sensation flooding them was familiar, mapped, survivable, that they had been here every night in the amber dark and the wall had never once gotten lighter, and they had climbed it anyway. The slack is biology. But Voss learned at Gate 5 with his heart's pounding, what the human had meant in the wash rack a term ago. The cutoff can be argued with. It just needs counsel. Grayspar took Gate 3 back on a feint Othek had never seen because the human had built it off Othek's own habits in a session 3 spans prior, and then Gate 2 on raw tempo, 9 cadets at a commitment level the fixture's arithmetic said they should no longer possess, and the gallery noise came down the hull like weather. They took the last gate with 40 counts on the clock. The board read it Grayspar by a half. The Ring's commentators called it the term's great anomaly, and the Academy's betting pools, which officially did not exist, called it various unprintable things, and Othek's squadmaster, a fair-minded old Ofex, did something Squadmaster had done all year, walked the length of the deck to the reset lines and stood in front of the smallest figure on the cable crew, looking down from twice his height. "You're the one they keep," she said. It wasn't a question, so the human didn't answer it. I cut 9 cadets at the term posting who had 4 times your aptitude scores." Her ear membranes moved, slow, some Ofex weather of their own. "I begin to wonder what exactly I was measuring." She walked back. The human went back to coiling cable. On the bronze slate by the muster hall, Grayspar's standing ticked to second of 9, and that evening the squad found that someone, Dargan never confessed, but it was Dargan. The weld bore all the subtlety of 4 Brel hands, had mounted a strip of old guide rail above the Grayspar barracks door, blank steel, unmarked, with a rigger's blade hung beside it on a hook. Nobody declared what it was for. Doctrine happened sideways. But cadets coming in from evening wall runs began, one by one, to reach up and touch the blank steel on their way through the door, the way you check a load, the way you check a habit, and the second term closed with Grayspar second on the ladder, 1 fixture short of Pharaoh, and 206 notches under the intake rail of the oldest hulk on the ring. Voss went home for the term break to the line hold on Tarvek Secundus, and found that he had become someone who described things. His line elders asked about the ladder as they always asked, expecting gate counts and standings, the accounting of a 6th-generation anchor. He heard himself instead trying to explain a small human running a combat hulk one-handed in the dark and a captaincy of 2 words called across a fixture deck, and the way an entire squad house had begun reaching up to touch a blank strip of steel. His eldest line mother listened with her plates folded, unreadable. "And this cadet's aptitude?" she asked at last. "His ceiling?" "Low," Voss said. "Lowest on the wall. Everyone agrees he'll never play a fixture. There's no projection where he plays." "Then what is he for?" She meant it kindly. Tarvek's pragmatism is a form of love, and Voss sat in the hold of his ancestors, where 6 generations of gate anchors looked down from the lineage wall, and discovered the answer had been assembling itself in him for 2 terms without asking permission. "He's the part of the squad that doesn't fluctuate," he said. "Everything else fluctuates. Form, luck, the draw, the gland. He's the floor. You can build on a floor." His line mother considered that for a long moment, and then said the thing that Voss would carry back up the well to the ring like cargo, like contraband, like a verdict. 6 generations of this line have stood in gates, child. You are the first to come home talking about what holds them up. The 3rd term of that year was the iron term, the one the whole ladder had been climbing toward, and it taught Grayspar the lesson that talent teaches when it finally takes a question seriously. Because the thing about Osek Tane, the thing the gallery's laughter at Concord had briefly let everyone forget, was that he was not only gifted, he was intelligent, he was patient when it paid, and he had spent 2 terms watching Grayspar the way Grayspar's human watched everyone else. Pharaoh met them in the iron final with a fixture plan built like an ambush. No early gates, no clock burning, none of the proven shapes the human had taught the squad to read. Pharaoh played even, gate for gate, trade for trade, 3 full rotations of match tempo, and Voss only understood it afterward, lying awake in barracks doing the arithmetic of humiliation. You could counsel a gland through a deficit. The squad had learned that. The squad was famous for it now. But Osek had not attacked their belief. He had attacked their bodies, evenly, for the full span of the clock, betting 6 years of Pharaoh conditioning against 2 terms of Grayspar habit, and on raw accumulated capacity. On the plain brutal ledger of mass and training years, Pharaoh was simply richer. Grayspar didn't slacken. Grayspar was still at full commitment when the final count sounded, every cadet spending honestly all the way to the horn. They were just spent in a losing cause, and the board read Pharaoh by 2, and Osek crossed the deck afterward and stood in front of the reset lines, in front of the human, and said, with the courtesy that is the cruelest register a Tarvex owns, "Count tonight's little rigger. The wall declined to kill you. The ladder didn't, 6 year 7. The pennant went back to Pharaoh's hall, and the academy ring rotated on, indifferent, through the stormlight of course. What Voss waited for in the days after, what the whole squad braced for without admitting it, was the human's response. They had all, without noticing, begun to organize their understanding of bad nights around it. The wash rack word, the two-word call, the small exact sentence that turned a loss back into information. It didn't come. The human hauled cable, ran the wall, cut his notches, 294. Voss checked and said nothing at all about the final, and the silence began to work on the squad like a missed shift on a rigger's net. It was Ketterell who finally broke and asked him, at the close of a dead rotation night, the whole tired file of them hanging off the gate 9 rail in quarter weight. "You've got nothing?" "7 years, O'Farrow, and the one fixture we needed you talking, you've gone quiet?" The human looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down on the gate lip, unhurried, the way he did everything, and was honest with them the way you are honest with your own squad in the dark. "You lost because they're better," he said. "That's all it was. No trick to read, no feint to drill. They have 6 years of bodies in the bank, and we have 2 terms. I can't talk you past that. Nobody can, and I'd be insulting you if I tried, and you'd hear the insult even if you couldn't name it." He worked his bad wrist, absent, a habit it had never lost. "Where I'm from, when you lose like that, clean, no fault, just outbid, there's only the one answer, and it isn't words. You go longer. They've got 6 years? Fine. Term by term, we out-year them. That's not a speech. That's just a schedule." He stood up off the gate lip. "I figure it takes until our final season. I'll be on the wall." And that, Voss thought, watching the squad absorb it, was the strangest captaincy he had ever seen exercised by someone with no rank at all, because what the human had just done was take Gracebar's worst night in 2 years and quietly reissue it as a calendar. The measure came for the provision that same span, because institutions can smell change before they can name it, and what they smell makes them itch. Formally, it was a curriculum review. The Office of the Gauge, the Academy's Aptitude Directorate, conducting a periodic audit of legacy training clauses, of which the auxiliary ascent provision was the oldest, and suddenly, the most discussed. Informally, everyone on the ring knew the shape of it. 3 squad masters whose houses had slid down the ladder had filed concerns. The word safety appeared in the circulars 11 times. The word anomaly appeared 4. Nowhere did any document say a human auxiliary has changed fixture outcomes, and we do not have a category for how, but the Academy was a Navy school. Everyone could read a chart by its blank spaces. The Gauge's examiners came to the Veridan on a 4th span morning, 3 of them, Kelleth and Ofex and a small severe Brel, and watched Gracebar train and watched the human stand in gates and be removed and stand in them again, and conferred in the careful murmur of officials assembling a conclusion they had carried in with them. Voss sat at gate 2, heard fragments off the hull steel the way Tarvex do. Mass differential outside tolerance, repeated impact exposure. No defensible development pathway. The cadets' own scores project no fixture utility at any horizon. It was the Brel examiner who put the question to the human directly, at session's end, while the squad pretended very hard to be busy with the racks. "Cadet Brandt, help us close a line of inquiry. The provision costs you 4 evenings in 6. Your aptitude ceiling is..." She consulted nothing. She had it memorized. The lowest of any cadet currently engaged with this structure. You will never be rostered. You will never play a fixture. The Academy offers excellent advancement tracks in logistics and rig management, for which your scores are, frankly, superb, and your superiors there have twice flagged you for accelerated postings you declined. So account for it. What return are you pursuing? What, cadet, is the yield? The human gave it real thought, with the examiner's recorders running, and the deck cooling and ticking around them, and his squad arranged in unconvincing industry along the racks, listening with every membrane and plate they had among them. "Ma'am, where I trained, there was a wall between the dock and the void," he said at last. "Every rigger walked past it every shift, and the old crews had cut a line into it. Years of them the same line over and over. The net is the crew. Not the net protects the crew, or the crew maintains the net. The net is the crew." He met the examiner's eyes, which Voss had seen ranking officers fail to do. "You're asking me what I yield, individually, and ma'am, I want to answer you. But the question's got a fault in the wording. I don't have a yield individually. Neither does a knot." A pause, and then, with that mildness the whole gallery had learned at Concord, "Inspect the squad. The squad's gone from 7th to 2nd in 2 years. If the provision's a cost, ma'am, it's the kind you should want invoiced everywhere." The examiners closed their session and went away, as examiners do, to deliberate at the speed of stone. The review would hang over the ring for a year and a half, unresolved. Institutions also know how to wait, and the human went back to the wall that same evening, because the wall was not subject to review until somebody said otherwise, and cut notch 295. But the conversation had loosed something into the squad's air, and it was Dargan who said it out loud that night at the house table. "With the bluntness Brels are issued at birth, they'll close it. A year, 2. They'll word it kindly, safety pathways, his own good. He'll be reassigned to a rig depot with honors he never asked for, and the wall goes back to being a wall, And in 10 years, it's a story second years don't believe. That's how this place works. He looked around the table with all four fists planted. Unless he's rostered before they rule. A rostered cadet isn't auxiliary. They can't reassign a name off the bronze. He can't be rostered, Ketterell said, flat, hating it. 9 slots. Squad scores set the cut. His numbers wouldn't make the bronze at any house on this ring, and if Hesh forced him on, the gauge voids the roster for cause, and we forfeit the season. They'd love that. It closes 2 problems with 1 ruling. Around the table, the silence of a squad arriving together at the edge of the map. And Voss, who had been carrying something for half a term, since a dead rotation night when the section lights had cycled and caught the intake lock's inner ring at an angle he'd never had reason to see, heard himself say, "There's writing on the Veridan." They looked at him, under the lock collar. Founder's steel, the original commissioning ring. It's worn, you'd need to know it was there. I've been back twice with a work lamp. He laid it out the way you lay out a load plan, plain, because his hearts were anything but. It's a toll line. Founder's right, cut into the hull at commissioning, same era as the provision, 10 words. He had not spoken them aloud yet, not even alone, out of some species of care he couldn't justify, and the house table waited and he gave them up. 1,000 essence buys 1 gate. The wall keeps count. Dargan's fists came off the table. Ketterell's membranes went very still, the listening stillness, the one she wore in fixtures at match point. It's a right, not a rule, Voss went on, older than the rule book. But this academy was chartered on its founding customs. The charter says so in its first line. Every cadet recites it at intake before they've drunk enough to forget it. The gauge can review a provision. I don't know that anyone can review the hull. He looked around the table, at his squad, at the blank strip of rail steel over the door with the blade hung beside it. He's at 295. Our final season ends in 7 terms. Run the arithmetic. They ran it, each at their own speed, claws and membranes and 4-fisted counting, and the answer came out the same at every seat. Brutal and possible. 705 cents in 7 terms, 100 a term, against 91 in his best so far. Every term, without fail, without injury, without the gauge ruling early, without the wall once getting lighter. It would take the most relentless thing any of them had ever seen, and then a margin on top of it. It was Ketterell who said what they were all circling, slow, like a fixture plan assembling itself out of the air. He doesn't ask for help. He'll log his own count, every notch his own hand. That's the right, his hand, his 1,000. Nobody can run a meter of it for him. Her membranes came up, but there's no line cut anywhere on that hull that says the squad can't hold his nights clear, covers cable shifts, take his rack duties. Walk the catwalks when he runs so there's never a session with no one on station. We can't climb it for him. She reached up, without seeming to notice she was doing it, and touched the blank steel above the door. We can be the net. No one proposed it formally. No one voted. Doctrine happened sideways out of love disguised as logistics. The next evening, when the human let himself into the Veridan's intake lock at the dead rotation's first bell, he found his cable shift already covered, his rack duty already claimed, a work lamp already burning at the gate 1 frame, and a Tarvex the size of a cargo door leaning against the bulkhead with his arms folded, as if he had merely happened to be on a decommissioned breach carrier at midnight. The human looked at all of it for a moment. Voss watched him assemble the picture, watched the one cadet on the ring who read everyone work out, in real time, that he had finally been read back. You found the toll line, the human said. You knew about it? I found it my first span on the wall. Work lamp same as you. He shrugged at Voss's expression. I didn't start climbing for the toll duel. I started climbing because the wall was there and the bronze wasn't. The toll just meant the wall and I had the same accounting system. He cinched his harness, that small economical motion the whole squad could have drawn from memory, and looked up at the gates rising away into the amber dark, 705 cents deep. But I can count. I've been counting for 2 years. Then mild as ever, with the rotation hum coming up through the deck like a tide. It'll be tight. Glad the net showed up. The next year, they're 3rd on the ring. The squad's 2nd as a thing the latter feared. Voss would remember afterward not as terms but as arithmetic. 100 a term, the table had said, and the table had been optimists, because the table had budgeted for a year in which nothing went wrong. The first term of it, things went right, which was its own kind of education. The human ran doubles. He had rebuilt his evenings the way riggers rebuild a load plan, stripping every gram that didn't carry. 2 cents a night on standard nights, 3 on the nights before rest days, his cable shifts covered, his rack duties claimed, his meals appearing at the gate 1 frame in sealed tins because Dargan had decided with Brel finality that walking to the refectory was 19 minutes a day the toll couldn't spare. The squad kept his nights clear the way they held gates, in rotation, without discussion, posting a watch on the catwalks so no medic could ever write the words no one on station. Ketterell charted his counts against the calendar on the inside of her locker door, where the gauge had no jurisdiction. By the terms close, the rail under the intake passage carried 411 notches, and Grayspar sat first on the young ladder, and the ring had begun to talk. Not about the toll, the squad spoke of that to no one, and the Founder's Steel kept its own counsel under the lock collar, but about the light. You could see it from the ring's window band if you knew when to look. The Veridan's intake section glowing its faint amber in the dead rotation, night after night after night, when every other structure on the Academy's rim ran dark. Cadets from other houses began drifting down to watch through the port, the way you watch weather on cores, something large and slow and indifferent to you. Some of them mocked, fewer than the year before. A Myrick fourth year stood at the port for an hour one night, and then went back to her barracks and reportedly told her squad, "I don't know what Grayspar pays for fixtures, but I watched the price of it, and it's open stock, and nobody's buying but them." And once, only once that term, Voss came up the catwalk for his watch rotation and found someone already standing at the port. Tall, plates like hull armor, alone, out of faro colors, watching the small figure work gate 6 1/4 weight with an expression Voss had never seen the ladder's best wear before. The look of a cadet doing arithmetic he didn't like. Ossick Tane stood there a long while. Then he said, without turning, 700-something more by my count. He won't make it. The body won't hold at that mass. The gauge will rule first anyway. Nothing in it was mockery. That was the strange thing. It was the voice of a captain reading an opposing fixture plan and finding, to his irritation, that it was sound. "Tell me something, Duel. At Concord 2 years ago, he invited me to the wall. Was that an insult?" "No," Voss said. "He doesn't issue those. It was an invitation." Ossick was quiet for the length of a full rotation cycle, the deck light cycling amber over both their faces. 6 years we've held the pennant," he said at last. "I have never once needed to do what he is doing. I used to think that was the proof I was better." He pushed off the rail. "I find I've stopped being sure what it was proof of." He left. Down on the deck, the human reached the gate 9 rail, slapped it once, the rigger's touch, load checked, and turned around to climb back down and do it all again. That same term, the year's intake posting gave House Grayspar a gift and a problem, and they arrived in the same body. Jorel Vin was a Quinn of the inner ring trade families, many-jointed, blade-fast, with the highest aptitude scores any house had drawn in 4 intakes. The gauge's circular said so, twice. And he came through Grayspar's door already knowing it. He was not cruel about it. That was what made him hard to teach. He was simply, serenely certain that the Academy was a ladder of engines and that his was the largest in the room, because every measurement he had ever been given agreed. He lasted 6 days before he said it out loud, at the house table, looking from the blank steel over the door to the duty chart to the squad with genuine unmalicious bafflement. "You train beside your wall fodder, at night voluntarily. The pennant houses are running conditioning blocks built by performance staff, and the famous Grayspar method is, what? Keeping a small human company while he loses to a building?" He spread 2 sets of fingers, reasonable, inviting them to hear themselves. "I checked his scores. You all know I'm right." Nobody argued. That was house policy by then, unwritten like everything that mattered. The night blocks were voluntary, the wall didn't recruit, and the squad had learned from the man himself that you cannot talk anyone past their own. Arithmetic. You can only wait for the arithmetic to fail them. Ketterell just moved the duty chart a hand width, so it no longer blocked the steel, and said, "You're right about the scores," in a tone Voss filed away as the most patient act of violence he'd ever witnessed. The arithmetic failed Jorel Ven in the 5th fixture of the term, against Myrick, in front of the full gallery. He was brilliant for 2 rotations, genuinely brilliant. The recordings made other houses' runners look like freight. And then his gate 2, exchange went wrong. Once a holder read his line early and put him on the deck. Twice the same read, harder, and the gallery made the sound galleries make when a circular's worth of aptitude bounces off old steel. And Voss, holding at 5, watched the thing happen that no score had ever measured, because no score was built where it lived. Jorel Ven met failure in public for the first time in his life, and his gland did exactly what glands do with unfamiliar cargo. The slack took him between one count and the next. Visibly, his tempo stayed, his commitment left. For the rest of the rotation, the fastest cadet on the deck ran at 9/10 with his eyes already drafting. The explanation, and Grayspar bled a half gate through the hole where his belief had been, and won anyway, narrowly, on the stamina of 8 cadets who had spent 2 years practicing the exact thing he had never once needed to practice. Nobody rebuked him. That was the part Voss watched him fail to understand for 3 days. The squad's silence was not punishment. It was respect for a lesson that could not be subcontracted. Hesh said nothing. Ketterell said nothing. The human, Hauling reset cable past him in the washrack corridor, said only, without stopping, in the tone of a man mentioning a free berth. Gate 2's open at 6 bell. It took Jorl until the term's last span to come. Voss was on catwalk watch the night the intake lock cycled, and the year's best engine stepped onto the Veridan's deck in a practice harness, trying to look as if he were merely curious, and found the small human waiting at gate 1 as though 6 days or 60 made no difference to a wall. What followed was the worst hour of Jorl Ven's athletic life. He was faster than the human at everything, and the wall did not care, because the wall was not a race. The transitions threw him, the holds outlasted him, the dead rotation stripped him of audience and instrument and excuse, and at the foot of gate 4, beaten by a building for the 11th time, the proudest scores in 4 intakes sat down on Founder's steel, with his joints shaking, and said, to no one in particular, it doesn't get lighter. No, the human agreed, from the frame above him, unhurried, with 3 years and 900 ascents in his voice. You do. He came back the next night, and the next. He never cut a notch. The rail was not his, and to his lasting credit nobody had to tell him so, but he built his own habit the way the converted always did, sideways, unannounced. He started arriving early to walk the catwalks the way the human had walked them before his first session, learning the hum, and by the term's close the gauge's finest engine had bolted itself of its own free will to the squad's old floor. The first time Jorl Ven reached up in passing and touched the blank steel over the barracks door, Dargan made the Brel clicking sound for a full minute, and nobody translated it for him, and nobody needed to. What went wrong arrived in the second term, and it arrived wearing courtesy, the way trouble on a station always does. The Office of the Gauge, its review still formally undecided, issued an interim directive. The Veridan, pending structural assessment of its century-old rotation mechanisms, would be closed outside supervised squad sessions. For safety, the notice was bolted to the muster hall wall on a 4th-span morning, neat bronze-rimmed composite, and it did what no fixture, no ferro, no fracture had managed in 2.5 years. It stopped the count. Voss stood in front of that notice with his squad around him and felt, behind his sternum, the gland begin its old withdrawal, the slack, arriving on schedule, metering the odds of beating an institution at paperwork and finding them unpriceable. And he heard Ketterell beside him say 2 words in a voice with no give in it at all, still there, which had become by then less a phrase than a place. Somewhere the whole squad lived. It was Squadmaster Hesh who broke the lock, and he did it without breaking anything, which was the lesson of Hesh entire. He read the directive twice, top to bottom, in the muster hall, with half the academy watching. Then he walked to the registry office and filed, in flawless administrative grammar, an expansion of House Gracebar's supervised session schedule. Evening conditioning blocks, 6 nights and 6, open attendance, squadmaster present. The directive said outside supervised squad sessions. Very well. There would be no outside. He would supervise every night himself, an old Tarvex, with a cracked plate standing watch on a catwalk through the dead, rotation, term after term, because the wording permitted it, and because, though he never said this part aloud, some debts run downhill through institutions for 100 years looking for someone willing to pay them. The first night of the new schedule, the human came through the intake lock and found the squadmaster on the catwalk above gate 1. He stopped. For a moment the two of them regarded each other across 30 meters of amber dark, the smallest cadet on the ring and the oldest plate on it. Session supervised cadet, Hesh said. Klim. Later that term, much later, after a conditioning block when the others had cycled out, Voss on watch heard the only conversation the two of them ever had about it. He didn't mean to hear it. Tarvex hearing means the hull tells you things. The human had asked, in his level way, why? Because I read the lock collar too, 40 years ago. Hesh's voice, off the steel, had the sound of something kept folded a long time. Stood where you stand. Started the count. I made it to 406. A silence, with the rotation hum under it. Then my fixture cohort came up, and the pennant runs mattered more, and I let the schedule decide. Cadet of your scores asked me once what I'd have been if I'd finished. I've had 40 years to work on the answer. The deck cycled. The amber light crossed the catwalk. I'd have been someone who finished, that's all. It's not nothing finishing. It is most of what a wall can teach, and I am one of the few officers on this ring qualified to certify exactly what it costs to stop at 406. A sound that might have been the old plate shifting. You won't stop there. I've watched you for 2 years. You don't have the gland for it, and I mean that, cadet, as the highest sentence of commendation I have ever assembled. 406. The human's voice, even, doing arithmetic of its own. Then between us we've got over 1,000. That's not how the right reads. No, squadmaster. But it's how the wall reads. Steel doesn't care whose hand. That's why the founders made it a handwrite, so it would cost a single life something. Real. They weren't pricing cents. A pause and Voss, motionless on the catwalk, heard in it the sound of two people looking at the same 10 worn words. They were pricing wanting it. By the close of their third year, the notch count stood at 662, and the cost ledger had entries the squad didn't chart on any locker door. The human's left wrist, the old fracture, had been resealed twice. His knees, at a mass never engineered for a Tarvex gauge wall, had begun to need the medic's attention on a schedule. He was 25 years old and walked. First thing in the mornings, like a man of 60, until the joints warmed. The squad learned not to schedule him for anything before second bell, and learned it without ever saying why aloud. The gauge's structural assessment found the Veridan sound, to nobody's surprise, and its review stayed open. A door an institution keeps ajar so it can choose its weather. Grayspar took the year's iron final to a last rotation count and lost it to Faro by half a gate. 7 years. 8. And the human stood at the reset lines, watching the pennant cross the deck to Ossic's hands, and what he said that night, on the wall, to nobody in particular, was, one more season, right on, and schedule. Who had grown up on a lineage hold where 6 generations of gate anchors watched you from the wall, understood at last, completely, the thing he would spend his career trying to teach other officers. That he had stood beside every kind of strength the charted volume offered, mass, speed, lineage, talent, 6 years of conditioning, a gland-deep instinct for the kill, and the strongest thing he had ever personally witnessed was a small, tired man checking a schedule. The final year opened with 2 postings on the muster hall wall, an hour apart, and between them they set the season's whole collision course. The first was the captaincy slate. Hesh named Vossarek Dul captain of House Grayspar, which surprised no one on the ring except Vossarek Dul, who had assumed it would be Ketterel and said so in the squad master's presence, and received in reply the longest sentence anyone had ever extracted from Hesh on the subject of command. Ketterel reads fixtures. You read what holds them up. Captains hold. The second posting carried the gauge's seal. The review of the auxiliary ascent provision was concluded. The provision was found obsolete, its safety profile indefensible, its developmental yield nil. The word nil sat there in official type, and Voss read it with the particular anger you feel toward a document that has been technically accurate and entirely wrong, and it would be struck from the Academy's training code at the close of the academic year, effective the day after the iron final. Existing auxiliary registrations would be honored until that date. As courtesy, the squad stood in front of the second posting, doing what the squad now did by reflex, arithmetic. The toll stood at 662. The year held 3 terms. The wall would close forever the day after the iron final. 338 ascents. 3 terms to climb them in. And this season, unlike any season before it, the climber's squad would be playing for the pennant while they held his nights clear, and the climber himself was 25 going on 60 at first bell, with resealed bones and a medic chart that had stopped being funny a year ago. It's not enough that he makes the count, Ketterel said quietly, that night at the house table. You all see that. If the toll's claimed and the gate's owed, it has to be owed at a fixture worth a gate. They strike the provision the day after the iron final. Her membranes came up, ink dark, steady. So it's the iron final. The founder's right, claimed at the one fixture this whole ring watches, against the house that's held the pennant 8 years. Or it's a museum story about a human who climbed a wall once. She put one long hand flat on the table. Captain, build the season. Voss built the season. He built it the way the human had taught all of them without ever once holding a lesson. Strip every gram that doesn't carry. Sink to your habits. Be still there at the end. Grayspar's fixture plans that year were not elegant. The ring's commentators, who had spent 2 years calling Grayspar the anomaly house, found a new word that final season, and the word was inevitable. Not because Grayspar dazzled, but because Grayspar arrived at every fixture with the bottomless, ungrudging, slightly unnerving stamina of a squad that trained every night beside a man doing something harder than any fixture, and knew it. They took Myrick by 2 gates. They took Calden by 3, in a fixture chiefly remembered for Jorel Ven's second rotation. The year's best engine finally running with its fuel aboard, fast and committed in. The commentators noted with some confusion, apparently enjoying being knocked down, since he kept coming up from Calden's heaviest reads with the expression of a cadet, checking a result against a theory and finding the theory sound. The semifinal was Othic, and the semifinal was the season's tax audit. Othic's squadmaster, the old fair-minded Ofex who had once crossed a fixture, decked to ask the smallest figure on the cable lines what exactly she had been measuring, had spent 2 years redesigning her house around what she'd learned, and her squad played Grayspar's own gospel back at them. Full commitment to the horn, no surrender to arithmetic, tempo built in long, unglamorous evening blocks. The gallery got the fixture everyone had stopped believing was possible. Two squads with no quit in either of them, and at the last rotation's turn Othik led by a half, fairly on merit, with the clock shortening like a fuse. Voss called the final set at the rotation gap with his squad's breath loud in the huddle, and found he had nothing to add to 3 years, so he used the inventory instead. Gate 2, he said. Jorl, they've read your line early all day, let them. Sell it one more time and break the read on the turn. Brandt built the variation. You've run it 40 nights. Everyone else, they're us. They'll spend to the horn. So this isn't about who believes harder. He looked around the circle, plates to membranes to 4 sets of Brell knuckles. It's about who's been broke before. We have. Make them learn it with the clock running. The recordings of that last rotation became teaching stock at 3 academies. Othik did not slacken, that has to be said. Their gland never fired, their belief held. The old Ofex had built something real, and it didn't matter. Because Grayspar produced the one thing belief alone can't manufacture. Precision under fatigue, the kind that is not a virtue but a sediment, laid down one dead rotation night at a time across 3 years until it was load-bearing. Jorl sold his lie and broke the read and took gate 2 on the turn exactly as built, and then stood on it against 2 retakes with his joints visibly past argument. Dargan held 4 at a cost the medics would itemize for a span. And the half gate that decided it came, fittingly, off the wall itself. A transition at gate 6, the deck's half-second hum, an Othik runner arriving a fraction proud of his weight, and a Grayspar holder who had walked the catwalks at 6th bell often enough to feel the change coming through her boots, and was simply, unhurriedly, already where the gravity was about to put him. The board read Grayspar by a half. Afterward, in the wash racks, with both squads breathing like docked freighters, the Othek squadmaster sought out not Voss but the human, who had hauled cable through the whole war with his brace squeaking, and stood over him in the steam for a moment, ear membranes working. 2 years ago I asked what I'd been measuring, she said. I've an answer now. I was measuring fuel. You people? She gestured at the racks, both houses, the whole spent magnificent evening. You measure the tank. She walked out. The human looked after her, then went back to coiling cable and said to the cable, in the tone of a man updating a maintenance schedule, good fixture. They're going to be a problem for years. It was, the squad agreed later, the highest praise on permanent file anywhere in his vocabulary. On the ladder's bronze, 2 names climbed toward the iron final from opposite ends of the draw, the way everyone on the ring had known they would. Pharaoh unbeaten, 8 years deep, and Grayspar. The count climbed with the season. 700 at the first term's close. The squad marked it with nothing but a round of touching the steel over the barracks door, because celebration spent minutes and the toll had a budget. 760, 800. The human ran triples now on rest day eves, 3 full transits of 9 gates, and Hesh stood his catwalk watch through everyone. And the amber light burned in the Veridan's intake section so reliably through the dead rotation that ring pilots on approach had reportedly begun, using it as a navigation fix. It was that term, too, that the wall got its second climber and nobody in House Grayspar saw her coming, which was fitting, because her own house hadn't either. She appeared at the intake lock on an ordinary 4th span night, standing just inside the cycling doors in a plain harness with no house colors on it at all. A Myrick 3rd year, stripped from their roster at the season posting, a holder whose scores had slipped below the line that bronze slates are made of. She had clearly rehearsed something on the walk down, and Voss watched her lose the whole speech at the sight of the gates going up into the amber dark, until what finally came out was 4 words. Pitched too loud for the silence. Does it take washouts? The squad mid-block stopped. The human came down off the gate 2 frame, crossed the deck, and looked up at her. She was twice his height. Everyone was, with the expression he kept for faulty mechanisms and honest questions. The toll's mine, he said. 1 hand, 1 count. That part's not transferable, and I won't pretend it is. Then he stepped aside, and the whole of gate 1 stood open behind him in the work lamp's light. But the wall was never mine. It was here 100 years before me. It doesn't check the bronze, it doesn't read scores, and it has never once asked me what house I was. He picked up a spare harness lead and held it out. Start your own count. The rail's got room. She climbed badly that night, and the next, and the span after, and she kept appearing, and then a Calden 2nd year started appearing, an Ofex with a medical flag who would never roster, and had decided, watching the amber light from the rim, that this constituted no reason to stop training, and by the term's close there were nights when the Veridan's dead rotation carried 4 counts at once. The human's 1,000-bound ledger, Hesh's resumed 400s, and 2 foreign hands cutting their first shallow marks into stretches of rail that no directive had ever thought to allocate. The Grayspar squad's reaction to this invasion of their house's secret weapon was recorded by history in full. Dargan welded 2 more harness hooks by the lock, and Ketterell adjusted the catwalk watch rotation, so the strangers were never on the wall unwatched, either, and nobody anywhere said anything official, because doctrine happened sideways, and the wall had started teaching other houses the same way it taught everything, by being there and staying open and never once getting lighter. The medics flagged the cost of all of it at midterm, as the medics were paid to do. The Keleth surgeon called the human in, walked him through the chart, the knees, the wrist, the accumulating ledger of a small mass spending 3 years against Tarvik's gauge steel, and concluded, with clinical honesty, "You are paying for this in currency you do not get back, cadet. I'm required to ask whether you consider the price proportionate." "Ma'am, you've met the wall," the human said. "Everything it sells is full price. That's how you know it's worth it." He took his chart, thanked her, he always thanked her, and was on the rail by 6th bell, because the count stood at 790, and the schedule had never once cared how anyone felt about it. 809, and then the knee. It happened on an ordinary ascent, which was the cruelty of it. No faulty section, no Brell mass, nothing to file a grievance against. Gate 7, a transition he had ridden 2,000 times, a half-second of hum, a landing his joints had absorbed since before half the squad knew his name. The left knee, resealed twice, simply finished. Voss was on the catwalk and heard the sound the human made, which he had never heard before in 3 years. One short breath through the teeth, immediately filed away, and then watched him finish the ascent. 2 more gates. On a knee that would not load, using the rail, using the frame, using whatever the wall offered, because an ascent abandoned at gate 7 was not an ascent, and the right read his hand, his 1,000, and the wall keeps count, and the wall did not award partial credit. He slapped the gate 9 rail. Then he sat down on the top frame and could not stand back up, and Voss came off the catwalk faster than he had ever moved in a fixture. The medics' verdict arrived the next morning, wearing the gentleness that institutions reserve for telling you the thing you already know. The joint could be rebuilt, properly, permanently, Earth-standard prosthetic seating, full function within a year. Or it could be braced and managed for some weeks of careful, reduced, low-impact use, during which further structural loading would be, the Keleth surgeon said, looking at her chart so as not to look at the row of gray spar faces, inadvisable to a degree I am required to document that I stated aloud. 191 ascents owed, 2 terms on the calendar, a knee with some weeks of careful use in it, and a right that counted no hand but his. The human listened to all of it from the examination bench, his leg in its brace, his expression exactly the one he gave gate mechanisms. Then he asked the surgeon a single question, and it was not about the knee. "The brace," he said, "is it legal under the rights wording?" The surgeon looked at the squadmaster. The squadmaster looked at the smallest cadet on the ring, 809 notches into a 100-year-old hull, and said, "Old Tarvex, cracked plate, 40 years of knowing exactly where stopping lives. The right says your hand, cadet. It has never once mentioned knees." So the last stretch of the toll was climbed the way the first stretch had been, slowly, alone in the doing, and surrounded in everything else. 1 ascent a night and no more, each one rebuilt from footwork up to spare the joint, and the squad watched their season and his count converge on. The iron term like 2 ships on one mark, and the ring watched with them because by then the secret had gone the way of all secrets on a station. Nobody official acknowledged it. The gauge issued no statement. But the gallery crowds at Grayspar fixtures had begun when the squad took a gate in the final rotation to chant a count, not the score, a number. Whatever the rail stood at that morning. 860, 904. The Academy's betting pools, which still did not exist, had stopped offering odds on whether the human would make the 1,000, because no one on the ring would take the other side. 971, with 5 nights to the iron final. And on the morning of the fixture draw, the office of the gauge, which knew how to read a navigation fix as well as any pilot, posted its quiet, final notice. Per the concluded review, the auxiliary ascent provision and all associated legacy customs, rights, and informal usages of the training hulk Varadin are without standing in fixture law, and no auxiliary cadet may be rostered, substituted, or fielded in any sanctioned fixture, including finals. All associated rights. 10 words on the founder's steel, struck through by 11 in administrative type. The squad read it in silence. The slack came for every one of them, on schedule and on schedule. In the voice of habit 3 years deep, somebody said it, Dargan, this time, still there, and the squad turned as one body and went looking for their captain. And their captain stood in front of the gauge's notice doing what he had been. Built to do by 6 generations of holding and 3 years of a small man's company. He read it twice. Then he read the Academy's charter, which hung where it had hung for a century, 4 meters along the same wall, and there it was, first line, recited at intake by every cadet who had ever drunk enough to forget it. This academy is chartered upon the customs of its founders, which precede it, and which it does not own. The gauge rules on fixture law, Voss said. Sitza law belongs to the academy. The right is cut into the founders' commissioning steel. It precedes fixture law, and the charter's first line says the academy doesn't own it. He turned to his squad and felt all 6 generations arrive in his voice at once. The wall keeps count, so we make the wall testify. Get every house captain on this ring to the Veridan's intake lock at 6th bell. Pharaoh first. Pharaoh, Ketterel repeated. Not quite a question. 8 years at the top of the ladder, Voss said. If the founder's right binds anyone, it binds the house with the most to lose by honoring it. Ossic's many things. Show me the day he's been small. Came at 6th bell, all 9 of them, because a summons from one finalist captain to another 5 nights before the iron final was not a thing any house declined to witness. 9 captains in 9 colors at the Veridan's intake lock, with Hesh standing apart on the catwalk stair as witness of rank, and the storm bands, of course, rolling their slow amber through the port glass. Voss didn't make a speech. He had planned one, and stood there with it assembled, and then set it down, because 3 years beside the human had taught him what speeches were worth against objects. Instead, he held up a work lamp and showed them the steel. The toll line first, under the lock collar, the 10 worn words the founders had cut into their commissioning ring before fixture law existed, before the gauge existed, before any of the 9 houses had a name. He watched 9 captains crouch in turn, captains of species that did not crouch gracefully, folding themselves down to founder's height, and read it with their own eyes. 1,000 assents buys 1 gate, the wall keeps count, then the rail. He walked them down the intake passage and turned the lamp on the underside of the old guide steel and let them see what 3 years of one man's hand had done to it. 971 notches, cut small and clean and patient, the early ones worn shallow already by the daily pass of the hand that had made them. Nobody spoke for a while. The Caldan captain ran a gauntlet along the steel the way you'd touch a lineage wall. The Mirret captain counted a stretch of it, lost the count, and stopped and stood there with her crest flat. The gauge says the right has no standing in fixture law, Voss said. Read your charter. The customs precede the academy, and the academy does not own them. That's the first line we all recited at intake. Fixture law is the academy's. The assent isn't. He let the lamp rest on the steel. The assent is ours. It was cut for the houses by the founders on this hull. So I'm not asking anyone to defy a directive. I'm asking the 9 houses to keep their own property. He turned to face the tall figure in Pharaoh colors directly. He makes his 1000th before fixture eve, witnessed by the captains. And Grace Bar fields him in the iron final, at gate 9 under the toll. If the gauge voids the fixture, it voids the season. Let them explain to 9 houses and 100 years of charter why the academy struck the founder's own steel, because one small cadet finished what it said. Silence with the rotation hum under it, and every captain on that deck turned, the way bodies turn toward mass, to Ossic Tane. Because Pharaoh was the other half of the final, and no compact meant anything without the house that had everything to lose. Ossic took his time. He walked the rail once, end to end, claws behind his back like an examiner. He crouched at the lock collar and read the 10 words again, though Voss suspected he had read them years ago and filed them where untested things were kept. When he straightened, he looked across the deck at the gates rising away into the dark, 1 to 9. 8 years the pennant's hung in my house, he said, and every year it's weighed less. I've had a long time to wonder why. He turned. I watched him one night 2 years back, from this catwalk. I told myself the body wouldn't hold and the gauge would rule first, both true by every projection. I have never been so confident of an arithmetic and so certain it was missing a term. His plates shifted, a slow rolling settle, the Tarvex gesture of a decision taking its seat. Here's Pharaoh's signature then, and Pharaoh's price. He plays a true gate, no ceremony, no shelter. Gate 9 is the anchor gate, and in the final rotation we will come for it the way we'd come for any anchor on this ladder. And if we take it, we take the pennant off it. He looked at Voss, and what was in his face was the thing the human had offered him across the Concord Gallery 3. Years ago, an invitation. He's earned a real gate, so it has to be real. That's the only honor that isn't an insult, Captain. That's the only kind he'd stand in, Voss said. They signed it that night, all 9, the way the founders would have understood. Not on composite, but cut. 9 captains' marks scratched into a blank plate of hull steel that Dargan welded below the lock collar before anyone could think better of it. Under a single line of booksscript the human was not consulted about and did not see until it was permanent. The houses keep their own count. The last ascents were hardest of the 1,000, and not because of the knee, it was the watching. Word had gone down the ring like current down a line, and the dead rotation stopped being dead. Cadets at the port glass in shifts, whole squads of other houses standing their own unasked watches on the outer catwalks, the amber light of the intake section burning its navigation fix into the dark with an audience it had never sought. 984, 991. He climbed exactly as he had climbed when no one came, one ascent a night, footwork built, the brace doing its work, the rail touched at the top, the notch cut at the bottom. And if the crowds changed anything in him, the only evidence was a thing he said to Ketterell, who reported it to the house table deadpan. 3 years to get an audience for net inspection. No accounting for taste. On the eve of the eve, with the count at 999, the office of the gauge made its last move, and its last move was a door, a summons delivered with full courtesy, Cadet M. Brandt, Auxiliary, to attend the gauge directorate at first bell regarding final disposition of his registration, an appointment timed with administrative precision to coincide with the only supervised session window left before fixture eve. Attend, and the 1,000th ascent waited a day and landed inside the gauge's jurisdiction like a ship surrendering its helm. Decline, and the record would show an auxiliary cadet refusing a directorate summons, which was the kind of small clean hook institutions hang large decisions on. The human read the summons at the house table, in the middle of the squad's silence, and for the last time in his academy career, did the thing that had built the whole long arc of it. He checked the wording. It says attend at first bell, he said. It doesn't say which. He looked up, and there was the weathering that wasn't quite a smile. 6th bell's first bell of the dead rotation. Rigger's clock runs on the watch, not the day. I'll attend right after my session. Be polite to keep it short, though. He folded the summons once and put it in his boot, where the rigger's blade lived. Clem's at 6th. So the 1,000th ascent of the Veridan was witnessed by 9 captains under a welded compact. A squad master on a catwalk who had stopped at 406 and stood watch through 600 more that were not his, a squad house that held the deck in a silence you could have rigged cable to, and, at the port glass and along the outer walks, by more of the academy than any iron final had ever drawn. He came through the intake lock at 6th bell with his harness cinched in his brace, seated, and stopped, as he always stopped, at the base of gate 1. If 1,000 knights had taught the ring anything, it was the next motion. He spat on his palms. Then he climbed it the way he'd climbed the first one, back when he was nobody's anything, patiently, economically, riding the half-second hum of every transition, a small unhurried figure ascending through amber dark while the gravity sections rolled their century. Old weather around him. Gate 4, where his feet had learned honesty in a cast. Gate 6, where Ossick had once stood at the glass and met an arithmetic he couldn't close. Gate 7, where the knee had finished, and where the whole deck heard, this night, nothing but the clean double strike of boots taking a transition that had once taken him. Gate 9, the rail. He touched it the way you check a load. Nobody cheered. It had gone around the ring beforehand, squad to squad, house to house. In the way of the Academy's real law, toll fixtures run quiet, let the wall keep count. So there was no sound at all on the old carrier as he climbed back down through 9 gates of silence, took the rigger's blade from his boot at the base of the intake rail, and cut, in steel that had carried 100 years of other people's standards, the small clean notch that made it 1,000. He stood up. Down the passage at Founder's height under the lock collar, the 10 words waited in the lamplight. He didn't go to them. He turned to the 9 captains instead, to the witnesses, because the right was a claiming, and a claiming needs ears, and said it level, neither loud nor small, a man closing out a shift. The toll's paid. I claim my gate. Gate 9, House Gracebar, the iron final. And then, because he was who he was, he added the only flourish anyone ever got from him, dry as dock air, inspections done, wall holds. Fixture morning, House Gracebar posted its roster at the muster hall the way every house had posted every roster for 100 years, names chalked. On the slate board beside the bronze, gates 1 through 9. Voss wrote the first 8 in his own hand. Then he held out the chalk, and the human, who had stood in the gates of that hall's indifference for 3 years, stepped up to the board he'd once had to crouch beneath, and wrote the 9th line himself. Gate 9 and Brandt Ox by toll. The gauge came, of course. Not with marshals. Institutions send marshals for enemies, and the Academy had finally understood it didn't have one. It sent the small severe Brell examiner, the one who had asked about yield 3 years ago on the Veridan's deck, and she stood in front of the slate for a long moment with her recorders shut off, which among examiners is a state of undress. The whole muster hall held its breath around her. The directive stands, she said at last, to Voss, because Voss was captain. No auxiliary may be rostered under fixture law. She let that sit precisely as long as it needed to. However, I have now read your charter's first line 11 times. I have inspected a certain weld below the Veridan's lock collar, and I find the gauge measures what the Academy owns. This, one small blunt hand indicated the chalk, the bronze, the whole morning, appears to be the property of the houses. conducted under a custom that predates my office. The gauge does not certify it. Her mouthparts did something that on a Brel might have been a smile clocking in for its first shift. The gauge merely notes that it has no instrument rated for it. Proceed, Captain. I'm told the gallery fills early for finals. The Veridan had never held a crowd like it. Every house, every year class, the instructional staff in their grays, the off-shift dock crews of the ring, and the silence. That was the part no recording ever carried properly, the part cadets who were there spent the rest of their careers failing to describe. An iron final, the loudest fixture of the Academy's calendar, conducted from first horn in the hush of the toll custom, thousands of bodies packed along the gallery decks and catwalks of a century-old breech carrier, all of them quiet so the wall could keep count. Pharaoh came out of the first horn the way 8 unbeaten years had taught the latter to expect, beautifully. Whatever Osik had spent his final season building, it was the best squad Voss had ever stood a deck against, tempo without waste, gates taken with the clean arrogance of cadets who had never learned what losing tasted like and had reorganized that ignorance into art. By the first rotation's midpoint, Pharaoh led by a half, and they had not yet so much as approached gate 9, and Voss knew Osik well enough by now to know exactly what that was. It wasn't mercy, it was sequencing. You tested an anchor early to learn it, then came for it at the death. The test arrived 3 counts before the rotation turned. Pharaoh's gate 1 runner, Selleck, prime line, 190 kilos of the ladder's fastest closing speed, came down the high transit at the anchor gate, and the gallery's silence got a texture to it. And for the first time in Academy history, a fixture's whole weight funneled toward a defender whose mass was a rounding error in the collision math. The human did everything right. Voss saw it all the way from gate 5 and replayed it for years. The low set, the brace seated, the half-second hum read perfectly, the wedge position that used the frame's own steel as a second defender. And Selleck took the gate anyway, because force is also true, and 190 committed kilos at speed will sometimes simply pay whatever the footwork charges and buy the gate regardless. The exchange put the human into the frame upright, and then onto the deck behind it, hard, the brace skating, and the silence of 3,000 people leaned in over one small body on old steel. He got up. Of course he got up. The gallery had 3 years of testimony about that. But the gallery had never seen it from the far side of caring, and Voss felt the hush change pitch, felt a crowd of 9 species discover all at once that they had at some point, without voting on it, stopped being spectators of this particular cadet. The human rolled to his feet, reset the gate he no longer held, and jogged on the brace, unhurried as a man crossing a dock, back to position behind it, ready to contest the hold. Pharaoh kept the gate 11 counts and lost it at the rotation turn, not to him but to the squad arriving like weather, Dargan and Ketterell running a retake the human had drilled into them off Pharaoh's own habits. But the gallery had seen what it had seen. The anchor could be bought. Pharaoh had the receipts and 2 rotations left to spend them. The second rotation was the finest sustained ascent anyone on the ring had ever watched, and the commentators' recordings, consulted, recut, and lectured over for a generation after, never once needed to raise their voices over crowd noise. Gate for gate, trade for trade, the board crawling level, and then a half apart, and then level again. Ketterell ran a feint at 3 that Pharaoh's holder would have sworn was Pharaoh's own because it was mirrored and returned with the rigger's annotations. Jorl Venn spent the rotation in a private war with Selleck that cost both houses their fastest legs and settled nothing. 2 engines revving each other down to fumes, and came off the rotation grinning through a split lip in a way that would have horrified the cadet who arrived with the circulars 2 years before. Hesh stood at the squadmaster's rail, doing the thing the squad knew meant total engagement, which was nothing at all, and Voss anchored gate 5, and at gate 5, in the rotation's last span, the fixture came for him personally. Pharaoh ran a stacked sequence at his exchange, 3 strikes resourced like a cascade in miniature, Osik's design stamped on every line of it, and the second strike caught Voss mid-transition and put him into the frame hard enough that the gallery heard plate meet steel the length of the deck. He held. The third strike came before his vision had fully cleared, and somewhere under his sternum, with the board level at an iron final, and his body suddenly billing him for 3 years of nights, the old gland woke up and offered him its ancient mercy. The odds, the mass, the arithmetic, the soft and reasonable withdrawal. 6 generations of gate anchors had felt that exact offer at that exact depth of a fixture. Voss would never know how many had taken it, because lineage walls don't record the moment of the offer, only the posting. What he had that 6 generations hadn't was a catalog. 3 years of nights in the amber dark, 100 evenings of being beaten by a building in good company, the precise familiar map sensation of continuing anyway, not as heroism, which is unsustainable, but as habit, which is load-bearing. the slack arrived and found the position already staffed. He set his feet on steel he had run 1,000 times, his own count, uncut, unkept, but his, and held the third strike the way the wall had taught him things get held. Not by being stronger than what arrives, but by being exactly where it has to land and declining to be elsewhere. The exchange broke on him. Pharaoh resequenced and spent its stack somewhere cheaper, and Voss stood at 5, with his plates ringing and understood, in the body at last and not the catalog, the sentence the human had said to a wash rack full of strangers 3 years ago. Where I'm from, that part's optional. And Gate 9 held. Twice more Pharaoh priced the anchor, sending mass down the high transit, and twice more the small defender made the mathematics expensive, never winning the collisions, surviving them, surrendering centimeters instead of the frame, wedging and re-wedging, riding the gravity section's half-second tells us so that Pharaoh's runners kept arriving at full commitment into weight that had just changed its mind. 11 counts of hold here, 14 there. He gave up the gate once more, and his squad took it back once more, and the rotation closed dead level, and the whole fixture came down to where everyone aboard had known since fixture eve that it would come down. The final rotation of the iron final, level board, the clock running down its last spans, and House Pharaoh began its cascade. Voss had watched the cascade end seasons for 8 years. It was Pharaoh's masterpiece and Ossic's signature, a rolling, accelerating assault that overloaded gates in sequence, each strike resourced by the one before it, conventional defense collapsing not because it failed but because it was solved locally, one gate at a time, faster than any squad could reinforce. The known counter was to out-tempo it early and force it to restart. Gracebar tried and bled for it and held the bleeding to a half-gate's cost, and the clock ran, and the cascade rolled on through the amber dark like the storm fronts of course below them. 5, 6, 7. The assault gathering itself up the hull, and the board still close enough that everything reduced to a single sentence of fixture arithmetic, the sentence Ossic had signed his name to at the lock collar 5 nights before. Take the anchor before the horn, and the pennant stayed home. Fail, and it crossed the deck. And so, with the count dying, the cascade delivered its last and heaviest mass to the high transit above Gate 9, and the gallery's 3,000-body silence compressed into something with weight of its own, because it wasn't Selleck this time, and it wasn't a lieutenant, it was Ossic Taine. He came down the high transit alone, the cascade's whole accumulated momentum behind him and none of it beside him, because that was the sentence he had signed. A true gate, no ceremony, and a true gate at the death of an iron final meant the latter's best taking the anchor himself or not at all. 8 years of penance came down that transit at closing speed, plates set, claws low, the finest fixture athlete of his generation arriving at the one gate on the hull defended by the worst. Voss was at Gate 5 with his own exchange to hold and could spare only fractions of attention, and the fractions were enough because what happened at Gate 9 happened the way the human did everything, economically. There was no collision. That was the first thing the gallery's silence absorbed, the thing the recordings got lectured over for a generation. Every defender Ossic had ever beaten had met him at the frame, met mass with mass, and been solved. The human didn't meet him. The human had spent 1,000 ascents and 3 years of falls learning exactly what the Veridin gave a defender, and the Veridin gave him the same thing it had given him on the first lonely night of the count. The hum. The half-second tell. The deck announcing, to anyone whose hands had learned to listen, that the section's century-old gravity was about to change its mind. He had ridden 10,000 transitions. Ossic, who had never needed the wall, had ridden the schedule's worth. The human set his wedge late, insultingly late, suicidally late, late enough that Ossic's line was committed beyond any adjustment a body that size could make. And he set it not where the gate's geometry said a defender should stand, but where the next transition said a runner's mass would have to land. Then the deck hummed. The section cycled. Full weight went to quarter weight under 240 committed kilos, moving at closing. Speed, and Ossic Taine, for the first time in 8 years on the ladder, arrived at a gate as a passenger of his own momentum, a fraction high, a fraction light, his landing point owned in advance by a man 1/4 his mass who had bought it on 1,000 nights of installment payments. They met at the frame because at the end of all the reading and the riding there is still a gate and it must still be held, and no tell in the universe repeals mass. The impact drove the human into the steel and the gallery heard it the length of the hull. But a wedge is not a wall. It is an argument about angles, and the angle held. Ossic's drive went where the wedge sent it, into the frame's own founder's steel instead of through the opening, and the two of them locked there. The anchor gate of the iron final jammed shut by, in descending order of tonnage, a breech carrier, a Tarvex Prime, and a dockhand from Cadby Tether with one hand clamped on the frame. His hand on the steel. The wall keeps count. 11 counts to the horn. Ossic reset and drove again and gained centimeters, because he was Ossic-tane and centimeters were always for sale. The human paid in joints and gave up nothing that mattered. His boots finding the frame, the lip, the rail, every purchase the old hull had ever taught him in the dark. 8 counts. A third drive, the heaviest, the one the recordings would slow to frame by frame. The human's brace skated, his line bent, his whole defense reduced at the last to the oldest position in his repertoire, lower than his opponent, inside his opponent's strength, attached to the steel like something the founders had welded there. 5 counts. Voss, holding at 5, heard the silence of 3,000 people stop being silenced without gaining any sound, an entire academy leaning its weight against one human grip. And then, this was the part Voss told for the rest of his life, the part that made young officers in wardrooms go quiet. The human looked up. Pinned at the anchor gate, the count dying, the strongest cadet of an era resetting for the drive that would end it one way or the other, and the smallest cadet in the academy's history looked up into 8 years of penance. With that expression the whole ring knew by now, the gate mechanism expression, weathering, level, very nearly amused, and said something. The recordings never recovered it. The gallery never heard it. Only Ossic-tane, plate to plate at the frame, received the human's last word of the fixture, and Ossic-tane never repeated it to anyone for 30 years. The last drive came. The wedge held, the horn sounded, grace bar by a half. What happens to 3,000 bodies worth of toll silence when the horn releases it is not cheering. Cheering is too small a word, and the recordings prove it. The sound that came off the gallery decks of the Veridan had hull steel in it, a single concussive wall of voice from 9 species at once, and under it, on the deck, the fixture's 2 final combatants disentangled from the anchor gate's frame and stood looking at each other, the way you look at the only other person who knows exactly what a thing cost. Ossic straightened first. The pennant was gone. Everyone aboard knew where it would hang now, and Tarvex of his line had been bred 10 generations deep to find that unsurvivable, and Voss, arriving at a dead run with the rest of both squads, watched the latter's proudest captain perform instead, with parade precision, the one act nobody in 8 years had ever seen him spend. He stepped back from the gate he had failed to take, came to full formal halt in front of the cadet who had held it, and bent, slowly, deliberately, in front of the entire academy until his cracked amber eyes were level with the humans. "The wall counts," he said. It carried. He meant it to. So does the ladder. So as of today does House Pharaoh. And then, straightening to Voss, captain to captain, with the ghost of the Concord Gallery in it. "Your mascot's number, Grace Bar, I find I finally want it exactly right." 1,000, said Milo Brandt from approximately the altitude of everyone's sternum, in the tone of a man reporting an inventory, and 1 gate. They did not carry him from the deck. The squad had discussed it in the way the squad discussed everything that mattered, sideways and in advance, and Ketterell had settled it with 1 sentence. "He has walked off this wall under his own power every night for 3 years. We are not going to be the ones who end the streak." So House Gracespar formed up instead, 9 cadets and their squadmaster, and did what was somehow enormously more. They fell in behind him, in fixture order, gates 1 through 8 behind gate 9, and the smallest cadet in academy history led the Iron Pennant's new holders off the Veridan at a dockhand's unhurried walk, through 3,000 voices, past the intake rail with its 1,001 notches, under the lock collar where 10 worn words had waited a century for somebody to finish. He stopped at the rail on the way out. Of course he stopped. 3 years of habit does not break for weather. And the whole gallery watched him do the small, ordinary thing he had done 1,000 times in the dark. He reached up and ran his hand once along the underside of the steel, checking the count, checking the net, checking that the day's work was where he'd left it. Then he walked on, and the academy poured down off the catwalks behind him, and somewhere in the crowd the chant finally broke loose. Not his name. The ring knew better by now. You do not chant a man's name when the man has spent 3 years teaching you that names on slates are not the point, but the number, the final number, the one the wall would keep. 1,000, 1,000, 1,000. The pennant went up in Gracebar Hall that night, on the hook that had stood empty so long the bracket had been painted over twice, and the house discovered that the moment they had imagined for 3 years lasted, in the event, about 90 seconds, after which it became a piece of cloth on a wall, and the squad stood around under it, not quite knowing where to put what they were feeling, until Dargan solved it the way Brels solve everything. He hauled the meal benches into a square, planted all 4 fists, and said, "Right, someone fetch the auxiliary. It's his hall too, and if he's on that wall tonight of all nights, I'm welding the intake shut." He was on the wall. Of course he was on the wall. They found him not climbing it, but sitting at the base of gate 1 with his brace off and his back against the founder's steel, looking up into the amber dark, with the expression of a rigger whose shift has ended and who has not yet decided what off-shift is for. The whole squad cycled through the intake lock and sat down on the cold deck around him. Pennant night, victory night, in the exact place where every one of them had been beaten 1,000 times, and nobody said anything important for a long while, which was, Voss understood later, the most important thing that got said. It was Hesh who finally spoke, from the catwalk stair, where 40 years of habit put him. Cadet Brandt, a point of accounting, the right pays out one gate. You've had your gate. The old squad master came down the stair, slow, his cracked plate dull in the stormlight. So as of the horn, you are a man with no standing on this wall at all. Auxiliary provision struck. Toll spent. By every line of code and custom on this ring, tomorrow you have no reason to be here. Yes, squad master, I'd noticed that. The human tipped his head back against the steel. I thought I'd come down tonight and see how it felt. And feels like a net nobody's assigned to check. Hesh stood over him a moment. Then the oldest plate on the ring lowered himself, joint by joint, with the dignity of a docking maneuver, and sat down on the deck of the Varadin beside the smallest cadet in its history and said, 406. You never once asked me to finish it. Wasn't mine to ask, squad master. The right reads one hand. The human paused, and Voss heard in the pause, the rigger checking the wording one last time. But it never says one lifetime. Steele's patient, the count's still open. I am 61 years old. Cadet. Then you'll want to keep the session supervised. The sound Hesh made then was one no cadet of House Grayspar had ever heard before, and it took the whole circle a moment to identify it, plates and membranes and four-armed silhouettes all turning in the amber dark. The squad master was laughing. It went on for some time. It had, Voss thought, the sound of something that had been folded away for 40 years and still fit. The office of the gauge struck the auxiliary ascent provision from the training code the day after the iron final, exactly as posted, with full administrative correctness, and discovered within the span that it had performed surgery on a shadow. Because the 9 houses had already answered, and the answer was welded below the lock collar where directives didn't reach. The houses keep their own count. The captain's compact, signed in steel by every house on the ladder, was renewed by acclamation at the next Concord table, the first measure in Academy memory to pass all 9 houses without a single speech. Under it, the houses chartered, funded, and staffed, as private founders custom outside the Academy's code entirely, a post that had never existed and had always existed. Keeper of the wall. Duties: maintain the Varadin's training availability in the dead rotation. Stand watch so no climber ever climbs unwatched. Keep the rail, keep the lamp, keep the count. The houses voted on the first keeper too. It took rather less time than the speeches hadn't. The Brel examiner came down to the Varadin once more before the year turned, alone, recorders off, and found the new keeper at the rail with a work lamp and a maintenance schedule. Voss, on the catwalk for one of the last watches of his cadetship, did not even pretend not to listen. Cadet, no, she corrected herself with the precision of her office. Keeper, 3 years ago I asked you what your yield was, and you told me the question had a fault in the wording. I have thought about that conversation with unprofessional frequency. She stood at Founder's height before the toll line, hands folded. The gauge measures aptitude. Ceiling, the size of the engine. I have spent a career assuming that what I could not measure was therefore marginal. Her mouthparts worked. I watched the iron final from the 3rd gallery. I am here to say aloud, where the steel can hear it, that the engine was never the cadet. The engine was the schedule. We had no instrument for wanting, and you should know that the directorate has opened a study of whether one can be built, and that I have recused myself on the grounds that I am no longer impartial. A pause. It is the proudest disqualification of my career. Ma'am, the human said, anytime you want to learn the instrument we've already got, the walls open at 6 bell, bring gloves. Voss graduated at the year's turn, commissioned into the breach corps with the gate anchor posting 6 generations of his line had held before him, and the night before his transport lifted, he went down to the Varadin for the last ascent of his cadetship. He had expected to make it alone. He should have known better. The intake lock cycled behind him and the whole of it came through, Ketterell with her new first officer's tabs, Dargan bound for the engineering yards, the roster, the squad, the house, and last through the lock, with a work lamp and the brace he now wore openly and a keeper's plain gray harness, the man the bronze had never kept. They ran it together, the dead rotation, gates 1 through 9, slowly, no one scoring, the way it had always really been done. At the top, at the gate 9 rail, Voss put his hand on the steel beside the humans and stood looking back down the dark length of 3 years. I came up the well with a question, he said. My line mother. She asked what you were for. I gave her an answer at the time. I've improved it since. The deck hummed. The section softened. Amber light rolled over the gates like coarse weather. 6 generations of my line have held gates, Brant. Strength holding against strength, and when the strength is spent, the slack takes the rest. I am the first of my line to learn that there's a deeper position. He tapped the rail once, rigger style, load checked. The thing under the gate. The thing the gate stands on. You were never trying to be a gate, were you? All this time. You were being what gates are bolted to. The human considered that with the gate mechanism expression, they're at the top of his thousand and some ascents. Where I'm from, he said at last, we just call it the wall duel. But he took his hand off the steel and offered it, earth style, and Voss took it. The grip that had held the iron final shut, swallowed whole in a Tarvex gauntlet, and somehow, as ever, the stronger of the two. The cut list went up at 6th bell, the way it always went up, and the new intake pressed toward the bronze the way intakes always pressed, 400 of them, crests and membranes and plates, reading the names of the kept and learning the academy's first arithmetic. Voss stood at the back in his new commission grays, his transport lifted at 8th bell. He had told himself he was only passing the muster hall, and had walked there directly and let his height do the work one last time. The bronze was the bronze, some names, most absences. The crush around it had its annual weather, the bright cadets finding themselves, the rest doing subtraction. But beneath it, at knee height, the gray composite board was not what it had been 3 years ago. Someone had refinished its frame, Brell weld work, all the subtlety of 4 fists, and the auxiliary muster sheet pinned to it was not blank. There were names on it. 11 already, in the first hour of the year, cut cadets, small cadets, a Myrick washout, an Ofex with a medical flag, an undersized Quinn from some outer belt tether who stood reading the sheets heading over and over as though checking the wording. The heading was new too. The houses had argued for a span over what it should say. There had been proposals with honor in them, and legacy, and iron, and then the keeper had been consulted, and the keeper had suggested, in the tone of a man filing a maintenance report, the version that now stood in plain block print above the signature lines, walls open. Counts yours. Voss watched the little Quinn crouch. It did not have to crouch far and sign. Through the muster hall's long port, out along the ring's rim, the Varadin hung nose down against the storm bands of Course, Amber, and Patient, the oldest structure on the station and the only one, Voss thought, that had never once changed its answer. 6th bell rang, the dead rotation began. And down in the intake section, exactly on schedule, exactly as it had burned every night for 3 years and would burn for 30 more, past 1, captaincy and into another, past the keeper's gray hairs, past 406 becoming, at the pace of an old Tarvex's patience, 500, 600 on toward a second 1,000. The steel was in no hurry about. The work lamp came on at the base of gate 1, a small steady light at the bottom of the dark, still there.